let me immediately start by welcoming Dr. Valérie Marcel for being here with us. A couple of words. Valerie led energy research at Chatham House for some years, between 2002 and 2007. She became an associate fellow in 2007, based in Dubai and Toronto before returning to London. She also advises governments on energy sector governance as a member of KPMG's Global National Oil Company team. Please, Valerie, the floor is yours.
I'd like to thank Sami and the Lebanese Center for inviting me and for addressing this question, because it just so happens that I'll just turn to the next slide, which is about this new producers group that I've been leading since 2012. It brings together emerging producers like Lebanon in the first steps of development of the resource. And I've been getting the question increasingly, when do you create a national oil company? What kind of national oil company? How do you create a national oil company? And so at the meeting we had, the annual meeting in March in Kenya, we were thinking we really need to address this. And now I have the opportunity to address it in the context of Lebanon, which I think is extremely useful to the rest of the group of the new producers group. So just to explain a little bit what this group is, because I think it's informing a lot the way I'm trying to answer the question about creating a national oil company in Lebanon. For a long time, I was studying established producers, those oil titans, the national oil companies like Saudi Aramco, Sonatrach, and ADNOC in Abu Dhabi. And then we turn to focus on the emerging producers and realize they don't face the same kinds of circumstances. They have geological uncertainty. They often have low state capacity, though that is not the case in Lebanon. They have low petroleum sector knowledge because they're new to this. So the international best practice that's commonly given doesn't necessarily fit there. What you're thinking of is getting immediate results now when you need it, and you're being across a negotiation table with a very qualified, hugely experienced international oil company. So this is sort of shaping a little bit the way that I'm answering, that I'm tackling this topic. So the first question that often I'm getting when you think about creating a national oil company in an emerging producer context is, what do you do with the profits? And in fact, this is because we are thinking of Saudi Aramco, we're thinking of ADNOC and Sonatrach. But the main takeaway that I would like you to have today is that that's the wrong question. The right question is, who pays? Because for many years, the national oil company is going to cost Lebanon. The Lebanese government will have to pay for it. There won't be revenues. So I think that's a really important way to reshape it. Now, if you look, this is very, debatable, and I'm really putting it out there with, as a very hypothetical timeline for gas to come in Lebanon, to sort of explain why it would take so long for the national oil company to generate revenues. Now, first, let's say that in 1 year there's a bidding round, though we've just heard that probably that's already quite optimistic. In 2 years, there would be drilling. In 3 years, there could be a find. So, yay, but actually not yay yet, because you have to go back to more drilling to consolidate the find so you have more, and you can justify a commercial development, something that's worth exporting. And let's assume now that in 6 years you have commerciality, so the finds are large enough to justify an export, an export plan like an LNG development, and that it's large enough to justify that threshold that's in the law about when to create a national oil company, which is when the discoveries are robust. So in 7 to 8 years from now, let's assume that the development plans that the international oil company operators propose are approved. In my view, that's already optimistic, because if you look at Tanzania, where they had PSCs in 2007, They were drilling between 2010, 2014. They made major discoveries, 55 TCS of gas offshore, and they still haven't come to FID, even though there's obviously a huge prize offshore to develop. And that's because it's taken the government a really long time to agree on how to deal with the investors, how to deal with the development. So then another 7 to 10 years for the project to produce gas. So we're looking at revenues in over 15 years probably. Okay, so I think that if you have an NOC during those first 15 years, it'll be an NOC that will not be able to draw on gas revenues. Okay, so I think the big questions from my perspective are, how long does the government want to carry the cost of the NOC before the revenues come? Do you want to start at well, in this case you could say pre-licensing, at exploration, once there's been a licensing round? Do you do it after the discovery? Do you do it at production? Okay. And then the question is a bit, who will pay? Because it's not all government. There's a way of generating revenues. The National Oil Company operating expenditure, sort of its running budget for these small companies that are the ones that we might think of putting together in Lebanon, the operating expenditure is between $1 million to $4 million per year. That can be covered by the state, but it's obviously at the expense of other development priorities that the state might have. The NOC capex, well, usually that is carried by the foreign oil companies until you get to a discovery or until production. But in fact, so that means that say if the NOC has costs that it must contribute as the other oil company partners for its 10% share, for example, that 10% of cost is carried by the foreign oil company partners, and the NOC pays it back once it gets the revenues from production. Okay, so the IOC doesn't do this for free. Eventually, it gets paid back for it, right? Then the question is, how big of a budget? So that depends on the role that you want to give the NOC. Okay, and this is what I'll discuss in the presentation: is how ambitious, what for, what's the NOC going to be doing? So what's the benefit to the state? And that's the key question: is what value is it going to add in Lebanon? So the question of profits is important, but it'll be coming later. It's a question that you do need to address, but at a later stage. So I think my main, so a lot of the comments that I'm making are going to be reflected in a paper that I'm writing. And I think that the main recommendations that I would have is that the NOC role should be useful, that it's a good investment for the government, that it's well delineated, because most NOCs will try to fill any vacuum in terms of capabilities or functions that are not being handled. So that's something to consider. There's that, you can call it a mission creep. You want to ensure the state can afford it, and that the NOC is financed, because most NOCs in emerging producer countries are struggling financially, and so they're not able to develop the skills that they need to be able to carry out their mandate effectively. And the key lesson from our group of emerging producers is really that the answers to all of those change over time, and you have to adapt. And you don't need a solution that's going to be fixed in time, one NOC that'll be valid and useful for Lebanon for the next 30 years. You can have an incremental process to most of these issues, because the situation, the backdrop changes so much. If you have a discovery, it changes so much once you build skills. So you can task the NOC with a different role. So here's to sort of the different stages of development. So we can sort of think about what would be useful at different stages. So normally I have stages 1 to 4, And here I added stage 0, which is pre-licensing, which is typical to today's discussion. Stage 1 is before commercial discovery. Stage 2 is after discovery, pre-production. Stage 3, early production or small reserve base. The reason for that distinction is because stage 3 is different from stage 4, large or long-term production, in that you don't have the same scale and long-term view. Okay, so if you're just a new producer, you might not have the size of revenues and the guarantee of long revenues that allow you to make the decisions that you would in stage 4. So I want to just go quickly on some potential roles that NOCs have. What's extremely characteristic of an NOC is that they somehow manage different balances of governance roles and commercial roles. It's what you could call like the national mission or the representation of the state versus it's more like business hat and commercial roles. So some NOCs, especially in emerging producing countries, but also established ones, carry out some of these governance roles. Some of them are the concessionaires. So they're basically like the LPA, and they oversee the sector, they monitor the operators, they handle licensing. Others have a more subtle governance role, which is to advise the Ministry of Energy or to advise the regulator or to sort of represent the state when it's talking to oil companies and sort of keep a watchful eye over operations on behalf of the state. So it can be more nuanced that way. Another one is managing data, which, because I can't decide how much that is a governance role or a commercial role, I've put it on both slides. And that's a bit the ambiguity of it, is that geological data, managing it, paying for it, managing it, and selling it to the oil companies is something that is a very disputed responsibility between regulators and national oil companies because it generates revenues. So it's a potential role for the NOC as well. Another one is a minority carried equity holder. So this is a very typical role for NOCs in an emerging producer context. What that means is that it's a commercial entity that owns a small equity share in fields, say 7 to 15% usually, and it's usually carried by the foreign oil companies. It could be a minor operator on some fields. It could be a major operator on some fields. It could be a downstream operator. An NOC could also be a marketer of the state's share of petroleum, so to sell its oil and gas on behalf of the state. Is there another one I'm forgetting here? Another one is more like the, I'll look at the potential roles in Lebanon and we'll focus on these ones. So these are the ones that are usually, that I sort of selected on the table for us to discuss and see whether they're appropriate for Lebanon, okay? Now the first one is an operator, and for reasons that I'll go into, I don't think that this is appropriate. Another one that is not appropriate in Lebanon is the concessionaire, because there is an established, very capable regulator. It would be counterproductive to create a national oil company that would be usurping those roles. It would create confusion and would be detrimental to governance. So I've even crossed that one out to be more clear about it. Then so the commercial upstream is one I'll discuss. It's sort of the NOC that is that minority shareholder, okay? Portfolio manager for state equity interests, that's sort of like the Norwegian Petoro. It's very similar to the other one. The difference is that the NOC would not own the equity. It would manage it on behalf of the state. It would be a little bit like a fund manager in the upstream, sort of making sure that the state's interests are protected in the development that the operators have. Another one is a commercial downstream company or a commercial marketer for the state's share of oil and gas that's produced. Okay, so An example for that one would be the commercial downstream would be National Oil Company of Kenya, which has been established since the 1980s and has established itself as a downstream company, and even I think takes 15-20% of the retail business in Kenya. A commercial marketer NOC is an example would be the Cyprus National Hydrocarbon Company, which is set up with that role in mind, though they're not in production, obviously. The other one is a maximizer of in-country value. So I put that one there. These are sort of, it's like menu items for us to consider. In reality, maybe an NOC would take on several aspects of these roles, but I've put them sort of separated so that we can think more clearly about what would be useful. An maximizer of in-country value, I'm going to look at the example of the Oman Oil Company, which was created because Oman had this idea that they'd had so many years of oil production and they hadn't developed enough in-country value. And so they created this company to sort of maximize the connections between petroleum sector projects and the economy. So to create companies that help to service the oil and gas sector. So I think that's an interesting, different model as well to consider. Now, first to talk about operator, why I said an operator is not, I think, on the table for now. It takes 10 to 15 years minimum to establish a company as an operator. An operator means that the NOC would have legal authority to explore, produce oil and gas from a given field. It would have to be able to select the appropriate technology, propose a development plan, raise finance, manage a large project, and be able to assess and manage geological and financial risks. So building the skills to do that is a very time-consuming and expensive enterprise. So the steps that are required is first to be that kind of commercial upstream company I was talking about with a passive minority equity stake. Then you become a contributing partner, which means you know how to go to financial markets and raise capital, which is a new set of skills. Then responsibility for a minor and then major complex field. So to go back to that new producers group, this is a slide from our guidelines that we have that are drafted as it's a producer-led initiative, and we have agreed on the recommendation that I underlined here, which I wanted to highlight, which was that it's best to wait to make significant investments in developing into an operator until you have at least 15 years of production guaranteed from your reserves, because it takes 10 to 15 years to develop those skills. Also, to be able to fund that operator development, you need to have production revenues, right? Because it's so expensive that you're not going to find the capital for that on the financial markets. So in Lebanon, that would mean that theoretically, if we were talking about 15 years until gas comes to be able to be sold on markets, add to that another 10 to 15 years of the time it takes to develop into an operator, we're looking at, in my view, thinking about becoming an operator in 30 years. So what roles do fit the timeline in Lebanon before you get to that point? If I go back to stage 0 and stage 1, I think in these two stages, there are no production revenues, right? There's little activity for the NOC to actually do. So in stage 0, pre-licensing, to the extent that the government has decided not to have state participation in the first round, that has decided it won't take a minority equity stake in the first licensing round, there won't be any state interest to manage. So I would say wait. In stage 1, and when it's preceding the second round, in anticipation of that second licensing round, if Lebanon wanted to create a modest company that would be a manager of state participation, that would be an option. Then then I think it's important to have a look at how that would be financed in stage 1. So last month I published a research looking at the cost of an emerging producer NOC in these various stages, and the conclusions are basically that before discoveries and before production, these NOCs really struggle to find finance. They usually get it from government, but because it's unreliable and the commitments from the budget change all the time, they start to look elsewhere for revenues. They ask the government for a levy on the sale of gasoline to generate revenues. They try to get data sales, and so in most circumstances they kind of struggle along. The benefit of that is that it forces the NOC to stay modest and that it doesn't grow too ambitious, because a lot of the NOCs that I studied when oil prices were high became way too ambitious, and now they've had to cut their staff by 3/4. So not all of them, but some that I studied. So post-discovery, the situation is almost the same, but the NOC is able to turn to financial markets because it has an asset that it can present to financial markets. So it gives it a little bit more access to finance. So after this discovery, you could have an NOC that is a manager like that Petoro type company, or you could also think of a company that is established more as a commercial agent and that holds minority equity stakes on behalf of the government, but that actually owns them and has to try to raise finance for those. I'm going to look at an example in a minute of a company that fits that type, okay, and talk about some of its challenges. I just want to mention that there's also the possibility after discovery that Lebanon would say, okay, we need gas in Lebanon to meet demand, so we may want an NOC to be a downstream company that invests, or midstream type company that invests in the infrastructure needed to bring that gas to Lebanon, to incentivize oil companies to forego some of the export and bring it to Lebanon. So I just wanted to give this example from Mozambique. ENH is the national oil company of Mozambique. Mozambique was advised by the Norwegians, like Lebanon, but since the 1980s. So they've established the system similar to Lebanon with an independent regulatory agency, and they have a national oil company. The regulator was established first. It's capable and competent and well-financed by government. And the NOC is meant to stand on its own feet and is really struggling financially. So it's finding it difficult to send its staff to training, and it's sort of like the poor cousin in the institutional setup. And so now it's very difficult because Mozambique has made major offshore discoveries. And post-discovery, the deal was that it had to put up the capital to meet its share of the cost in the fields that had, I think it had like a, let's say 10%, I think, equity stake. And so finding the money on that scale for a major LNG development it's very difficult for that company. So it's something to consider that they might struggle. Stage 3. Now you have some production, you have some revenues. So I think here to take on this slide is really just that case I talked about. Cyprus choosing the NOC to be the marketer as a state share, and GNPC in Ghana, one aspect of its mandate is to be the national gas aggregator. So they have some associated gas offshore, so its job is to facilitate bringing the gas onshore for use in the market in Ghana. So in stage 3, the options as I see them are that Petoro style manager, the commercial upstream like the Mozambican company, downstream company like GNP, like that aspect of GNPC's mandate in Ghana, or national oil company in Kenya, or the state marketer. And when you get into stage 4, then we can look at, operator in addition to the other roles. So then we can ask the question, how do you manage profits when you get into that production stage? And I won't talk about this too much, but I think just simply put, you have a choice between a national oil company that retains revenues at the source. Whatever sales of oil and gas it has, it retains the money, pays royalty tax and dividends, for example, as if it were an international oil company. And that enables it to have a degree of certainty about its forward availability of revenues. The other option is for it to function like a state ministry and have a budgetary allocation from government. Then the state has greater control over the finance. It knows exactly how much the national oil company is going to have, but the NOC will always be struggling financially. There are some other models, but I won't really go into them. Now, the big question, I think, in the Lebanese context is, how do you get a good and well-governed national oil company? I've been hearing that this is really a big consideration to do it right. On this chart, you have the 5 principles of good governance that were identified by our group of producers. This was the established producers back in 2007. And I think it applies very well as a guideline for how to create a system that is really good, well governed. So you need an NOC, as I said at the beginning, with clarity of roles, and you have to have very specific limits on what those roles are, okay, and how it's going to those roles to avoid any overlap with other institutions like the LPA. You need it to be enabled to carry out the roles assigned. It has to have some degree of financial certainty and to be able to invest in developing its skills. Skills building is extremely important, but also enablement means that it's not interfered with all the time. The most critical thing that makes a failed NOC is one that is politicized, one where MPs or government or cousins can pick up the phone and give a call to the NOC. And as soon as there's a phone call, there's a problem with the NOC. And, I think that's a really difficult one to resolve, but you have to have extremely explicit rules about that to try to avoid that political interference. Enablement through political interference also comes up in the board of directors. Who you put on the board, how the members of the board are influenced or not by political considerations. That also is a key factor in the enablement of the NOC. But of course, the NOC doesn't just need to be enabled, it also needs to be held to account. Transparency is a key step in that accountability. The NOC has to be able to keep good accounting practices, report regularly to a very high standard. So even an NOC like Saudi Aramco, which never discloses anything to the public, is very rigorous in its transparency to the shareholder. Its accounts are audited by an international accounting firm, and the accounts are audited are reviewed by the board of directors. To facilitate accountability, you also need very simple, clear lines about who is responsible for the oversight of the company. In Lebanon, the system of accountability for the LPA is very simple. It's very clear. That's good for accountability because it's the responsibility of the Council of Ministers to hold the LPA to account is clear. Then the issue is whether the body that holds the NOC to account is competent and up to the job. That's also extremely important because you can have the best data in the world, but if the body that's meant to oversee it doesn't care or doesn't know how to read into the data, they're going to miss a lot of problems with governance. It's like I was giving the example yesterday of national oil companies I was studying that showed budgets that had very big capacity building element. So they were putting a lot of money in training. So that looks good. And you say, yes, that's good. But then when you looked a little more closely, you realized that the National Oil Company of Liberia, when you divided the budget for training per employee, it was $58,000 per year per employee. So someone didn't do their job in holding that NOC to account for its budget, because that was really excessive. The NOCs tend to have, with not just bringing profits, but meeting the needs of the country in a broader sense. And that aspect of the NOC's mandate has to also be very clearly defined to avoid, growing too big. But it's something that can be a useful role that an NOC plays. I think the other point in an emerging producer context is that, as I said earlier, the situation changes. And so it's very useful to be able to reassess where you stand every couple of years. To have a very credible, influential, well-respected body that oversees where you stand in terms of the governance of the sector, in terms of the role that the NOC has, how it interacts with the LPA, how it interacts with the other organizations, with civil society, whatever is the concern. So you would reassess, looking at where you are at the top of the cycle, where you are in terms of the resource base. How much scale and time ahead revenues do you have? What can you afford? Then you look at the NOC role. Is it clear about what it's meant to do and what it's not meant to do? Then you look at the enablers, as I discussed: finance, capabilities, autonomy, governance. Then you look at the accountability. Is the NOC held to account? And then you can reassess this as the situation changes. Now, just quickly on the governance structure, I think that our general recommendation in the new producers group is that in the initial stages, because you don't have a lot of specialized staff, you don't have a lot of financial resources, it's good to concentrate. So to keep it simple, with a view of once the sector grows, once the implications or the risks of doing it wrong or of being poorly managed grow bigger, when you get into production, for example, then you start to keep a watchful eye on that concentration of responsibilities, and you may create more checks and balances, right? So initially, it probably would be simple to have a board of directors over the NOC, and that board of directors be accountable to the Council of Ministers, for example. Though this is something that would really be for discussion today, because I'm just testing these ideas with you, as I'm speaking more from a theoretical perspective here. A way of introducing more checks and balances, or a different oversight structure, which is something that has been done in more established producers, is to introduce above the board of directors a petroleum council. In the Gulf, it's a Supreme Petroleum Council. In other countries, it might have a different name, but it's a body in which the more political development agenda can be better coordinated with the NOC strategy. So it's sort of setting the NOC strategy, reviewing it, approving it, but also making sure it's coherent and aligned with national development priorities. So that can add a level of accountability or checks and balances that can be useful. Now, for my final slide, I think it's really important to anticipate how adding an NOC will change the governance structure and how it will interact with the Lebanese Petroleum Administration, the LPA. There tends to be competition between the regulator and the NOC. The fact that the regulator is established first is preferable, because it means that we'll have a stronger hand in that competition. But it's important to keep a watchful eye on that. And you want to make sure that their roles are clarified to each other and that they complement each other. You don't want competition for the roles. I think another lesson I have from looking at other producers is that if there is a vacuum, it will be filled. If you don't have a policymaking role, but you see that policy isn't being made, well, you'll step in and make policy. If you notice that no one is doing proper promotion of the acreage, you step in and do it. That's sort of the basic fact of how it happens. So you have to keep a watchful eye on that. Filling that vacuum is okay, but you have to be explicit about the fact that you're doing it temporarily, and that you have to have an exit plan for carrying out a role that isn't officially given to you. The other thing is that an NOC needs an explicit financing model. The government needs to be very clear about how an NOC can finance itself, because as I described all those struggling NOCs, when they don't get money, they find it in creative ways. So creative ways sometimes is somewhat innocent, like cocoa farming, in some countries, but sometimes it's quite detrimental, as you can imagine, activities that are outside the sector and that revenue generation that takes away from other potential government institutions. Then, as I said, the NOC should follow high standards of accounting and reporting, but is meaningless without a capable organization to hold it to account. So you have to have the big picture of all the institutions involved in the sector to create a good NOC. And I'll end there and hope we look forward to your comments and responses to these ideas. Thank you.